Hello, welcome. My name is Neha Vasakha, and I'm the host of the podcast series The Feminist City. This is offered by Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, and in this series, we think about cities, our relationships with the city, and exclusions in the city. And I'm very happy to present today's episode where I will be talking to Dr. Shilpa Phadke. Dr. Shilpa Phadke is an associate professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Her research interests include gender in the politics of space, sexuality and the body, the middle classes, feminist politics amongst young women, feminist parenting, and pedagogic practices. If you have been listening to this podcast, you would have already heard the name of the book, Why Loiter? Women at Risk on Mumbai Streets, which she has co authored. And I'm extremely excited to be bringing her to speak to me and to us about her work. And basically, what I would say is I've been a fan of Dr. Phadke's work for a long time, and her academic papers are a treat to read. So, with that, thank you so much, Dr. Phadke, for coming here.
Thank you, Sneha. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's a huge honor, and I'm going to do my best to control my excitement. So, just to start off with this conversation, I think the first question I think I would like to ask you is, you and your co-authors had written Why Loiter almost a decade ago. And recently, I think you've commented as well as, with the way in which women's safety is now, it seems to be a quintessential recurring question. And it's come up again with recent proposals where in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, governments are floating ideas of surveillance using AI and asking women to register at police stations for their protection, which is also sort of happening at a time where young women across the country are being targeted for political activity. So I was just curious to hear what you think of Why Loiter and the arguments you made about paternalistic protectionism and women's access to the city and, the violence of normal times, as you so poignantly put it in your writing.
So yeah, I feel like you're asking a deeply contemporary and deeply relevant question to the moment that we find ourselves in. And our book is actually exactly 1 decade old. So this month, it is 10 years, the book is 10 years old. And in some
Wow.
ways, we find ourselves in a space where nothing seems to have changed. I'd say the mainstream discourse or the feminist, sorry, not the mainstream, the feminist discourse on access to the public has transformed significantly. But in terms of the space we find ourselves navigating, in some ways things have become considerably more restrictive, if you like. And the proposals that you suggest, and the proposal put forward by the chief minister of Madhya Pradesh, the suggestion, even the throwaway suggestion that women would have to report at a police station so that they could be tracked, is deeply, deeply alarming, I think. This idea that surveillance is what would provide safety. And one of the things we've argued in the book, and I think it's never more true than now, is that protectionism never provides access. That protectionism, however benevolent, however well meant, eventually only puts up boundaries, only puts up walls, and restricts women's movement in very, very particular ways. So, and responding also to the ways in which young women are being picked up, are being arrested. I think again 1 year ago, the anti-CAA protests. So women, young women, old women, women across religion at the forefront of these protests. And I think that in some sense it was the culmination of decades of women's activism in relation to access to the public. That here you had women leading protests as citizens and protests for citizenship in many ways. And I think that is something that
Yes.
was deeply unsettling. If you remember, a person no less than the Chief Justice of India recently remarked in relation to the farmers' protest, in relation to petitions that were being heard in the Supreme Court in regard to the farmers' protest, that there was no need for women and old people to be kept in these protests. This itself suggests the
Yes.
deep anxiety about the presence of women in public as protesters and as citizens. And this comment immediately underscores that women's proper place is in the home, right? The home which also does not belong to them
Yeah.
in many ways. That then the anxiety of women as citizens, as agents, mounting an embodied protest, right? The bodies of women which should more properly be located in the home, now being in public.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, as you were speaking, I was also thinking about how, yeah, I mean, it's been a year, but during the CA and RC protests, it was so many young women, young trans people, young non-binary people, even within, I think it was actually in Bombay, where they were picked up after, the queer pride parade and were targeted by the state for, I don't know, carrying placards and talking about political questions, which also is interesting because I think some of, even, lately there is also a depoliticization of certain, even queer pride as a form, which is a protest, where we're all only supposed to talk about our issues. We're not supposed to talk about anything else that, happens in the country. And I was actually curious how you would link this to what you call the violence of normal times, in terms of how do we understand what we have to give up if we then, subscribe to the protectionist narrative of the state. Because what are the things that women are supposed to be giving up in order to be safe in the city, quote unquote?
Both the protectionist narrative and, as you pointed out, the neoliberal narrative of individualism, right? That, for instance, in a pride, you should only be able to discuss your little individual sort of middle class issues of queerness or whatever it is, and do not venture into the larger political space, right? Which then,
Yeah.
exactly as you pointed out in your question, it depoliticizes the issue of queerness entirely, because a lot of queer struggles, feminist struggles, are about being linked to other struggles, right? Whether it's the environmental struggle, whether it's the farmer struggle, or the Adivasi struggle. We are seeing now that even movements in relation to the environment, movements for climate change, are being targeted. And one of the messages that seem to be going out by jailing young people, by arresting them on charges which surely are not going to be able to stand in a court, right? That because there is no charge, there is no legal
Yeah.
basis to the charge being made, is to generate a kind of anxiety, right? Keep quiet or else. And I think that there is a message being sent particularly to young people who seem to be at the forefront of these struggles, whether it's in the pride where again young people were picked up, or it's in relation to simply editing a document online, right? Where a climate change activist can be picked up on no grounds, really. One won't even say flimsy grounds. There are no grounds for this kind of arrest. So when we see
Yeah.
when we see this, it's very much, so to connect this to the larger, or to the ongoing struggle that women have been engaged in for the right to public space. A lot of this then is about the kinds of visibility you may be allowed, right? And it's one of the things we articulated in our book as well. Again, it's this kind of, you can be a consumer and you can be an employee, but you mustn't get involved in other kinds of politics of visibility. So do not demand rights as a citizen. You can only be consumer. And I think that we do need to connect this both to the kind of anti-democratic environment we find ourselves in today, and the neoliberal space that we find ourselves in today.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that really stood out to me in your book was also where you link the privatization of the city and the public space and public private space. Because when I talk to my friends, and recently I asked somebody, okay, where can you go out, which is a public space, where you don't have to pay money, where you don't have to, where it's free and open. And we couldn't really come up with too many places, because it's almost like a public space as an open space where free entry and everybody is welcomed almost seems to have vanished. And
Yeah.
what, like, I would love to hear, because I think the consumer and we as consumptive subjects of the country, rather than citizens with fundamental freedoms and rights seems to be, because it's almost like freedom to consume, but not freedom to, I don't know, protest or demand, is the case right now. And the second question that I sort of wanted to ask is linked to both of these questions. One is the shrinking of public space, and two is the way in which safety narratives often mask moral panics around, as you call them, undesirable liaisons with across caste, class, sexuality lines, right? And we've also seen the passage of really dangerous laws with the fig leaf of anti-conversion that is blatantly being used to target young couples, especially young interreligious couples, intercaste couples. And Valentine's Day was just around the corner. I was curious about, because you talk about this, the right for pleasure in the city. So could you just comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and to start off with the Valentine's Day, the Valentine's Day is something that feminist activists and advocates for many years have critiqued, right? Critiqued as being
Yeah.
neoliberal, as tied in practices of consumption, and it's deeply ironic in many ways that in the last few years we have found ourselves defending precisely this kind of right to romantic love, because now even this right, a right which at one level is deeply individualistic, is also under siege. So we all laugh when we sort of put out social media posts defending Valentine's Day, because 20 years ago we were out there sort of critiquing it, and so one has traversed a very long distance, I think, in those years, and not in a good, and certainly not in a good way. To rehearse the arguments you point out from our book, one of the things we realized very, very sharply was that the anxiety about access to public space for women, particularly from the perspective of families and communities, was certainly partly about women being attacked by strangers, and it's always about strangers, right? It's never about people, because the same families will often refuse to acknowledge, or even if they acknowledge, not do anything when you're harassed by people within the family, by neighbors. They want to silence it, they don't want to address questions of incest and so on. So it's always about strangers. But coming back to that question, so the anxiety is partly that you will be attacked by strangers, but just as much the anxiety is that you will form consensual relationships with unsuitable men, which, as you pointed out in your question, men of the wrong class, men of the wrong caste, men of the wrong religion, just or even in more conservative setups, just men your family have not chosen for you. Because the question really is
Yeah.
not about consent, right? Families have very, very little problem about marrying you off to strangers whom they have chosen, right? And in our country also, there is no
Absolutely.
law against marital rape. So it's not about women's consent
Yeah.
at all. It is really about familial control of female sexuality. And to come to this question of sort of love jihad, which one needs to repeat over and over again, is a bogey, right? There has been no single proven
Yeah.
case of love jihad, not a single one. Even the ones that were put out as cases turned out to be fake, right? They turned out to be fabricated cases. So
Yes.
and the ordinance, the Uttar Pradesh ordinance that you refer to, right, which under the guise of conversion seeks to control who young people can be. And if you remember, there was that one case where a young college couple went out to eat a pizza. They went to a restaurant to eat a pizza, and this young Muslim boy was picked up, right? I mean, they were not marrying, they were not doing
Yeah.
anything. They went out to eat a pizza. So a lot of it is simply about controlling who, and they're also very, very Islamophobic in nature, right? They are about pointing to Muslims in this country that they are second class citizens, and it is, I think, it is a deeply divisive and increasingly terrifying agenda, this kind of thing that
Absolutely.
is targeted at the Muslim community in this country. And I feel like it's important for us to say that, to point it out, and to continuously raise our voices against it, because that too is tied to this vision of who our women are, who must then be protected from their men, if you like.
Absolutely.
um yeah, yeah, in a sense.
You're absolutely right, and I think it also ties down to the question. I think you've addressed this in your book and other places as well. And even we, like when we look at the law, the fact that the marital rape exemption continues to persist, or the fact that domestic violence is much higher than actually. I mean, the biggest. I mean, study after study that shows that. I mean, women are murdered in their families at a much higher rate than they're subject to any kind of violence in the public streets. And when we think about safety for women in the city, the focus suddenly becomes public spaces. But what about the homes inside the city that, women are being subjected to violence in? So the question that I think I would come back to, I mean, the other point I just wanted to add to what you said is that I think Islamophobia has always persisted in Indian society, but recently it's the legitimacy that has now been given, and it's become state policy, so to speak, in order to use now the machinery of the state to perpetuate something of this kind. And we move so far away from constitutional morality. Now we no longer think of ourselves as Indians. Yeah. And and and, and draw our morality from the constitution, and it's in such a regressive step where we move back to parochial, religious, and caste based standards. And in this context, I think the last question about safety in particular that I wanted you to address is one of my favorite papers is the one you've written about desexualizing risk, and where you talk about the right to risk, and then you talk about why the excessive emphasis that's laid on sexual safety, as opposed to just safety and well-being for women across psychological, physical, and other kinds of non-sexual violence, is part of this paternalistic logic. I would love for you to talk to me a little bit about that, and just explain why, what actually makes women safer, whether at home or in the city.
Uh, I should start by saying that in my argument about sort of sexual violence and the need to see it along a spectrum of other kinds of violence, I draw a great deal on Nivedita Menin's work in this regard. And this whole idea that somehow sexual violence is seen to be so much worse than other kinds of violence, and that's again tied to a variety of things, right? It's tied to the idea that sexuality is the core of who you are. It's tied to anxieties about sexual and reproductive control of women. And it's tied to the notion of honor, right? That if somebody is
Yeah.
murdered, their honor is not besmirched. But if they are sexually assaulted, if they are raped, then their honor is besmirched. And one of the arguments I often use, one of the examples I often use in a class in relation to risk, is to say that if I walk out onto the road at midnight and I get hit by a bus and I break a leg, then various kinds of legal and medical processes will apply as a matter of course. But if I walk out onto the street at midnight and I get sexually assaulted, before any medical or legal processes, both of which are required, can apply, I will be asked what I was doing there, whom I was with, what I was wearing, and why I needed to be there at all. Right? And I think this really is the core of why sexual violence somehow is seen as an act of violence apart from other kinds of violence, including that of murder. And one of the things that Flavia Agnes, feminist lawyer Flavia Agnes, has always said in a variety of situations, she said that women are often trained how to avoid rape, and she says nobody trains women how to survive rape. She says that you're often told all the things you must do to avoid getting raped, and she says that you're also fitted in with this mentality that rape is somehow a fate worse than death. And she says, in fact, of course, it is not, right? So if you find yourself in a situation, you should also be taught how to survive with the minimum number of injury, with the minimum kind of violence upon your person. And so coming back to your question, I think it's important for us to see sexual violence along a spectrum of violence, and somehow not see it as, if we can de-link it from honor, if we can de-link it from this strange idea of izzat, that somehow something about you is
Yeah.
violated that other crimes do not violate, I think we might find ourselves in a different space. In terms of what would keep women safe, one of the things we say in our book really is that that safety is again a kind of a goal that obscures other kinds of issues. It suggests to you that it's something that's achievable, where in many ways there is no safe space, right? You could shower in your bathroom and slip and fall, right? So your bathroom is not safe. So you could, I mean, you could be walking on the road and you could slip and fall and break a leg. So really the goal has to be about access. And if we see access, not safety, as our goal, because like you pointed out, the home is not safe. In fact, for women across the world, the home is the most unsafe space. The greatest amount of violence against women takes place in the private space of the home and is perpetrated by people known to women, right? So, and that nobody tells women don't stay
Yeah.
at home. In fact, we urge them to be in this very space. So really safety it stops us from seeing the real issues. The real issue has to be access. The real issue has to be consent. And the ways in which, I mean, as we argue in our book, one of the ways in which women might have greater access is if we ask for access for everybody, because it is only when all citizens have access can women claim unconditional access. And one of the things we were thinking about sort of 10 years from the book, we argue this in a chapter we call Unbelongers. And we were looking at the Unbelongers chapter recently for an event that we are doing. We were thinking of reading some lines from it, and it's quite stark to think that the lines of division are very much worse now than they were in 2011 when the book was published, and certainly very much worse than between 2002 and 2006, 2003 and 2006, when we were researching the book. So I
Yeah.
think that yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've responded to your question, but really what women need is both, to reiterate the argument we made in the book, both the right to claim risk, that is, not that I should never be attacked because no space is safe, but that when I do access public
Yeah.
space, nobody should question my right to be there. And two, that not just women, but all marginal citizens, including those who are seen to be not friendly to women, should also have access to the public.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that's thank you so much for saying that. A lot of my research drew heavily on your book, which is why because one of the things that I was also reading, and I realized even in as you were speaking, I was thinking about is it's also legitimate forms of violence and illegitimate forms of violence, right? Like if you're beaten up at home, that's okay. Your father's hitting you or your husband's hitting you. So there is violence that women are supposed to live with and condone, and I think it also comes in the context of a Brahmanical patriarchy in this country with because I think sometimes I think it's probably because we're not taught women's history. History is just they teach us men's history in college or schools or wherever. We're not taught women's history. It's I sometimes I think when I'm reading some of these texts, it's shocking to me that women didn't have the right to vote in parts of the world until recently. Women were not considered to be human beings until a couple of centuries ago, and that these were questions that. And we see the remnants, I think, because I studied law and legal history, that there's a doctrine of coverture where on marriage in British law, women's identity was subsumed under the man's, or on the exemption for marital rape is explained as, oh, you consented at the time of marriage, so that consent holds through the course of the marriage. But you see the same logics that persist. And recently I was also horrified because I was reading Radha Kumar's book on history of doing, and she talks about how police wouldn't file cases at a time where dowry deaths were tens and thousands of women were being burnt alive in their homes, and it was seen as a private matter. And it's almost as if throughout all of this time, the notions of what is the violence you have to normalize and naturalize, what is the violence that is wrong and has to have such extremely punitive punishments. So you have death penalty, you have all these, like really, really high carceral punishments for women's safety. But that it continues that kind of legitimacy and illegitimacy around that question, which yeah, I think sort of came out to me when you were talking.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That certain forms of unstructured violence, so this violence by strangers particularly, receive huge attention. So even if we look at news media, somehow, one of the things we say in the book is that while of course it's important that sexual assault is reported, and it's not as if we are suggesting it should not be reported, the language in which it is reported often produces anxiety, right? It says fear stalks the city is dangerous for women after dark, so what it does is, one of the things we found in our workshops, particularly with young women, and we did a lot of them, is that every time there was a widely publicized assault, what young women would express was the fear, not that they will be attacked, but the fact that this reportage or that this incident would restrict their movements further, that their families would say, oh, look what's happening outside, you better not go outside. So there's unstructured violence which gets reported and which is seen as violence, and then there's what you pointed out, this structural violence, so which is that I might go out late at night, I might really have a brilliant time, and certainly in some cities in this country it is still possible. So in Bombay it's still possible to go out late at night, I mean, well, not right now, but at most times, to go out late at night, have a good time, and you might look over your shoulder and you might make a couple of calls and you'll be careful or whatever, and you'll produce safety for yourself in a variety of ways, but it's possible. But if you overshoot, so if you're an 18-year-old woman and you overshoot your curfew, when you go home, some form of violence is going to take place. Either you'll get shouted at or you'll get grounded or some form. But that is never seen as violence, right? That is seen as protectionism, concern, and very often we call it love, right? So structured forms of violence are never called violence, and women experience restrictions on their movement and their mobility and their access to public space as violence. And this is something we really need to acknowledge. And one of the things we say in our book, and I think perhaps it's one of the lines I feel is like really, really central to the argument of the book, where we say that we need to start rethinking the way we see questions of safety, to see not violence but lack of access to public space as the worst possible outcome for women.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more.
So I feel like that we need to reframe the way we see this.
Absolutely. I mean, you've touched upon something that, I mean, I think every young woman in this country experiences. I've had so many fights with my parents to let me go out, because when you grow up with a male sibling, you immediately see around puberty the differential treatment in the home. So you understand that, he's not asked questions, you are asked questions. You're not supposed to go out, he's supposed to go out. And then that is never seen as anything, because it's all done for your protection. Except these are also families. I mean, the strangest thing about India is, in the name of honor killings, families kill their own children because you've transgressed the lines of caste, class, and community in the form of marriage. So it's often, and which is why it was also really interesting to me to think about safety not just from a perspective of protecting from sexual violence, but also physical violence and emotional and psychological violence. And we don't seem to have those conversations because they just don't seem big enough. Like, if domestic violence or your parents are really harsh and critical about curtailing your rights, and if they're slut shaming you at home, and that's so common in our schools and in our colleges to tell women, dress better, decency, you are, and that shaming is constant. And one of the things that I was really interested, I think I was watching a webinar where Samira Khan was speaking, and she talks about how there are these young women, if their boyfriend is dropping them home, they would get off much earlier than they've come to their home, walk down a unlit lane because they don't want the neighbors to see. So we actually are subjected to more unsafety because our families will punish us for being adults and exercising our basic rights.
All of this that you say is underscored by victim blaming, right? That eventually women constantly imagine that should something happen, they will be blamed for it. And like you're saying, the example that Samira gave from our work is that women, we found, were far more concerned about their reputations than they were about producing physical safety for themselves, that they would put their reputations before they would put physical safety. And I actually want to go back to your earlier question on what would make women safe, what would make actually young people safe. And one of the things that I feel very strongly from my later work on feminist parenting, and just also looking at narratives of young people in public space, I feel like one thing that would make young people safe is if their parents have their back. That quite often couples, particularly in public space, are again shamed, by police, and police in various cities at different times of the year will go on what they call anti-obscenity drives. And what do their anti-obscenity drives often consist of? Picking up couples who are holding hands. I mean, this is their vision of what constitutes obscenity. And of course, obscenity laws in our country are so vague that that it's possible for them to do that. And they often shame couples, and particularly young women, by saying, "Shall we call your parents?" And the tragedy of this situation is that for those young people, and particularly for those young women, their parents are scarier than that policeman. They really don't want that policeman to call their parents. And so they are put in a very, very vulnerable position and rendered very unsafe. How much would change if these young people could say, "Call my parents," or to say, I have already called my parents, they are on their way here. And if those parents turned up in that space and said, "You have no right to tell my adult child what to do. My adult child is holding hands with another adult, and that's perfectly fine with me. And you should just stop." How much would transform for young people if their parents had, or if their families, I mean, parents, guardians, elders, anyone who is a responsible adult in their lives, if any responsible older adult in their lives simply had their backs. I mean, how much would change, not just for women, but for men, for all young people. And I feel like this is something we need to be telling people, telling parents of young people, that they really need to,
Absolutely.
even if they don't agree, even if they hate what their children are doing, if they care for their children's safety, if they want to keep their children safe, then
Yeah.
they need to create a space where their children are not more afraid of them than they are of the outside world.
Yeah. I mean, this is the next. I mean, I thank you so much for saying that. I mean, my mother listens to these podcasts, and I've been having a lot of conversations with her around what does it mean to be safe? What does it mean to want to wear what I want to wear and step out? And then this is always an ongoing conversation where I've heard her say something like, you know, if you live in Bangalore or Delhi, wear what you want. Don't do that in Hyderabad, where I'm from. Don't do that in this neighborhood because the people here don't understand. So you have to be, you have to belong in the neighborhood that you come from. You have to, and she says, don't, don't stand out in any crowd. It's always her worries has always been that. And I've often heard also, a lot of woke progressive men say, women are more patriarchal than men. Women, like mothers, are the ones who actually teach their children. It is like there is this notion that, oh, but like women are women's worst enemies. Mothers actually teach it's very, I mean, it's always funny to me, but I'm actually really interested in also asking you to talk to us about what do you mean by feminist mothering or feminist parenting. And I'd like to just contextualize it a little bit in the context where in this country, often when I complain about law, people ask, oh, what will actually solve the problem of sexual violence? My answer has always been comprehensive sex education. Have comprehensive sex education, do it from an intersectional feminist perspective, actually talk to young children, adults, everybody at every level about psychosocial awareness, just teaching people to manage their own emotions and giving them language to talk about their feelings and, teach consent from a young age. But we are a country that has such an overwhelming taboo over the word, sex. Yet it's the country with the highest levels of sexual violence. So in this context, how do you see what feminist mothering is, and how do you link it with the things that you talk about in My Loiter?
So I should actually flag and say that my work on feminist mothering is much more about what goes on inside the heads of women who are feminist, who have either by a quirk of fate become or chosen to be parents. So it's not so much about practices of feminist mothering, but how they navigate the world as feminists and as mothers. So I'm not sure I entirely have a researched answer to your question. So I should flag that. I mean, there are probably many people who are better equipped to respond to your question. And the question on sexuality education is one that I learned a great deal from a former PhD student of mine called Ketki Chaukhani, who did a fabulous PhD dissertation looking at what she called the limits of sexuality education. And she mounts really a very interesting critique of the different kinds of available sexuality education, and also sort of makes a case for learning include from a variety of sources, including from pornography. So it's a really cutting edge and exciting dissertation that she's been writing, sort of publishing from. I do endorse entirely what you're saying, that we do need an open conversation, and sexuality education is one of the ways in which that conversation is opened up in regard to questions of consent, for example, and that's something that we need to talk about a great deal. Um, Coming to your, I mean, and this is something, I think, this question of risk or how to keep your daughters safe, and a lot of the work, a lot of my research has been on via interviewing feminist mothers of daughters, and one of the things that I think many mothers struggle with is that how do you provide your daughters with both agency, and yet at the same time, because that's how you feel, how do you at the same time, quote unquote, keep them safe. And I think here one needs to say in the strongest possible terms that women are not women's worst enemy, that at best, what we might see as patriarchal diktats or patriarchal ideas coming out, sort of articulated by women, uh, are ways in which women have learned to navigate their own lives in a patriarchal world, and they feel that that's what they're teaching their daughters to do. They may not be right, and it may not be the best thing for their daughters, and their daughters increasingly, and I think it's great, their daughters are increasingly telling them that they're wrong, you know and I think that that's wonderful, that space that daughters have, and that daughters carve out. Sometimes they struggle to carve that space for themselves to say that you're wrong, but I don't think that older women are doing this in the service of patriarchy. I think they are trying to teach lessons they feel they have learned about how to navigate patriarchy, and those lessons may no longer work. I mean, they may not work for younger women, and younger women, I feel like, have the space and the gumption, and they're doing it. They're telling older women that it's wrong, and but I think that we need to say it many times, that women are not women's worst enemies, that certainly mothers are not, in the most, for the best part, and in most cases, are not our worst enemies in any way. um yeah, coming back to, I'm trying to think what was your central question there. I got sort of waylaid.
Sorry, I asked you three, four questions in one go. Yes, yes, that was no, it was essentially that. I think I just wanted to know your experiences in feminist mothering and how it sort of links to how do you raise girls and children in a society like this, in cities like ours? Because on one hand, because there are these are the logics that operate. I mean, I just wanted to,
Yeah.
because when you were talking about this, I realized, like you said, 10 years ago you've written a book, and in some ways things nothing seems to have changed. I often feel this way when I go back home. It's like I left home 10 years ago while I went to college, and when I lived at home again a couple of years ago, I felt like I had changed so much, but my world at home hadn't changed. My home didn't change, my society there didn't change. And it also gave me a lot of sympathy for my mother in the things that she was telling me, because I realized that when I behave in the ways that are in tune to my understanding, I was not listening to the comments of the locality. My mother was. It was about she's a bad mother because her daughter is out of control. Not my father, but my mother. And somewhere that kind of system where mothers are under so much pressure, because it's not like that they have to survive, their daughters are a reflection of them. And so I was just curious to hear the struggles that you face, maybe as an individual, both living in a society like this and trying to be feminist in the way that you parent.
So again, sort of speaking to the example, or the sort of the to respond to the example you offered. I recent well In the last 2 years, I did a sort of a small research project talking to single women about their conversations and their relationships with their families in regard to the question of marriage. So marriage talk, I called it marriage talk. And a lot of women talked about the ways in which their relationships with their mothers transformed over the years of that marriage talk, and how much flack their mothers, exactly like you're saying, in terms of what you wear, your mother would hear about it. Also, in terms of if young women refuse to marry, then their mothers are bad mothers for not convincing them to marry. So if a mother said what to do, she's not interested, so somebody else would say, if it was my daughter, I would lock her up and insist she got married, tacitly indicating that you're a bad mother, you can't control your daughter, you're not able to bring your daughter to heal, and eventually what you're doing is bad for your daughter, because you know it's good for your daughter to marry and produce 2.2 children or whatever, you know. So mothers do get a lot of flack.
Yes.
Speaking about myself, my daughter's 10, so I think that maybe my struggles with a certain kind of parenting are only beginning. But I think that one of the things that I encountered when she was very little was being seen as an asocial parent, because my every time my daughter refused to go to somebody, I would say that she doesn't want to come to you, or she doesn't want to hug you, or she's not going to do that, or and I would be seen as an asocial parent, as an unfriendly parent, as someone who didn't want to share my child. But it was simply my being respectful of the space that my child wanted. And I think that one of the things we need to teach our children is that they deserve space even from us. So even now, sometimes if I go to hug my daughter, she'll say, I don't want to be hugged. And my responsibility at that moment is not to demonstrate hurt, not to say, oh, you don't you don't love me, because that's the worst possible thing I can do. Because what I'm doing is I'm setting up a scenario then where if she's heterosexual or whatever, if some man will be able to tell her 10 years down the line that if you don't sleep with me, you don't love me. So if I say, yes, you don't want to be hugged, that's your right. And I don't think that if you don't want to hug me, you don't love me, or it's an expression of your love for me, or an expression of your feelings for me. It's simply what you feel at this moment, and that your body is entirely yours. I feel like that's something, because instinctively, even in a joking manner, your instinct is to say, oh, you don't want to cuddle me. Why don't you want to cuddle me? And I feel like it's an instinct we need to suppress. It's a moment at which it's a teaching moment for yourself. It's a learning moment for oneself to recognize that by respecting your child's bodily boundaries, you remind your child that their body is sacrosanct, even from the people closest to them, even from the people who have changed their nappies when they were little children. Their bodies are sacrosanct, and that nobody,
Yeah.
not even their parent, has the right to demand affection from them in any way. The other struggles that women have talked to me about also are about sort of, I mean, this is something that all of us engage with as feminists, right? What do you do with your own struggles with, say, or your own attitudes to body hair, to body fat? Like how do you avoid saying I'm on a diet? Like, if you're on, if you're I mean, as many of us have been taught to be concerned about weight. Increasingly we are taught to be concerned about weight, not just as an aesthetic issue but as a health issue, right? Constantly you're being told that you should lose weight for
Yes.
your health. So some of the struggles that women articulated was that how do they talk about their bodies in a way, with their children, in a way that does not lead their children to be to have low self-esteem, or to have body issues, or and these are struggles that feminists have, because even as we intellectually understand something, we don't always practice it, right? You may shave your legs, you may do all kinds of, you
Absolutely.
may be you may be practicing
Yeah.
things that you yourself intellectually know are sort of, yeah, on the
Yeah.
cusp of, sort of. So yeah, I think these are,
Mm.
and of course, I think one of the questions is, how do you recognize your child as a person with agency, right? Because quite often, and this I say it tongue in cheek, but I think it's true, that as feminists, we train our children to see themselves as people with agency. And you want your children to fight the world, but you want them to fight the whole world, but not you. It's like, don't turn these arguments on me. It's, so you teach your
Yeah.
child to be deeply critical, and the first person they're going to practice it on is you. And that's the moment at which you have to
Yeah.
realize that you've and of course there's a book that's coming out very soon by a scholar named Sonora Jha, which is called How to Raise a Feminist Son. And I think it's really important for us to, and this is something that many people have been saying, right? How do we raise boys? And I think that it
Yeah.
is at one level far more difficult to raise a feminist boy than it is to raise a feminist girl. Because as the mother of a
Yeah.
daughter, my daughter can already see at the age of 10 that there is a gender discrimination at work. She can see it. And it is, of course, in her interest to be a feminist.
Yeah.
But if I'm raising a boy, how do
Yeah.
you get your child to recognize privilege? So, for instance, it's far more difficult for me to get my child to see caste privilege than it is for me to get her to see gender discrimination. Because as a girl, she is on the margins and she sees it. But as an upper caste person, she does not see caste. So again, I feel like the responsibility
Yeah.
is so much more to teach our children about their privilege, to teach them about class privilege, to teach them about caste privilege, and if you are raising boys, then to teach them about gender privilege. And I think it's far more difficult to do. And one of the ways we do it is to go on having conversations and to go on pointing it out and hope that they see it. To also point out privilege of gender
Yeah.
in the ways that being cisgender is a privilege, to feel at home in the body
Absolutely.
to which a certain sex has been assigned. So if you're a person, and I tell my daughter this, if you're a person who is assigned sex female at birth and you feel at home in that definition and in that body, that's a privilege too, because
Absolutely.
not everyone feels it.
No, absolutely. That is, I mean, that is so important. And I think, yeah, and I feel like that actually is how we then become, I mean, we talk about political citizenship or empathetic citizenship. It all starts at home, right? Like being able to sort of notice it in our immediacy rather than fight someone else's struggles. We all practice caste. We all practice, these kinds of issues. I will leave you with two last questions. The question that I think that was coming up to me while you were describing this, whether it's body image, whether it's these struggles that we all face, and we've touched upon this, is this the consumption that the capitalist paradigms of development that seems to be the sole model of development in the country anymore. Now, every time we talk about the city and urban development, we all want to be Singapore or New York. We don't want to be Bangalore or Mumbai. And then, even then, we see that we are all. It's almost like then when I was reading about urban planning, I was reading about all of these critiques that feminist geographers were making in these cities that we want to emulate. And it's almost like we're importing these problems with this uncritical assumption around development. And another thing that's also happening in this kind of model is there is this privatization of management of parks. In Bangalore, for instance, parks are not open during the day. They're only open during specific times in the morning, specific times in the evening. And this is led by civic activist groups. It's actually citizens, but your middle class, the kind of uncles and aunties I feel like I've experienced in the resident welfare associations in my home where I live. So, like, I mean, I wanted you to sort of because the last question was about feminist imagination, but I wanted to sort of, the last before question I wanted to focus on is how does one resist that when there is such the privatization of public space to the point where there are no open and public spaces, where everything has to be paid for. So we can't even go to a park anymore without being sold to. There are advertisements in our park benches, where there are park benches, which are few and far between. So we are a captive consumptive audience, and we are only supposed to be consuming or being sold, or being sold to. So and how surveillance now, with data, and data being the new the entity that has to be monetized constantly, um what do individual women, especially in times like COVID where we can't step out, what can we do? What are individual roles in both the fighting the paternalism as well as neoliberal capitalism, which feeds into that kind of structure?
Wow, that's a whole lot of multiple questions, and very complex questions, and great questions. So to partially respond to perhaps only some of them, that what you're saying is absolutely right. There is a deeply exclusionary agenda at work here, right? And into 2003, 4, 5, when we were doing our research, parks didn't actually close in the afternoon in Bombay. Now they close in the afternoon in Bombay as well. And I think that one of the things we need to uh, make a case for is really parks without fences, one that is open, accessible, and as we articulate in our book, the most accessible and the friendliest and in many ways a very safe park is the Shivaji Park in Bombay, which is in fact one of the very few parks that only has a low katta wall around it. It doesn't have a fence, and in fact it is among the most friendly spaces for all kinds of people to be. So I think that we do need to talk about it. But to sort of respond in a tangential way to your question is that after we wrote the book, a lot of people would ask us, but how are you going to operationalize loitering? And we would sort of not always know how to answer, because here was a vision we had. It was at one level a conceptual vision, at in many ways it was a utopian idea of how we imagined the city to be, a city that was inclusive, a city in which different kinds of people could be as citizens and be recognized as citizens. But in 2014, a theater artist by the name of Neha Singh, well, actually, she's a writer and theater artist and many other things, by the name of Neha Singh, read our book, and along with a group of women, she began loitering in the city. And she grew what she called the Why Loiter movement, which then I think was taken up in other parts of the city. And one of the things I've learned from her is that these everyday acts of claiming, and she'd say they'd be walking late at night, sometimes, and in small groups. So it was not a take back the night march, there'd be two of them or three of them or five of them at most, and she'd say a kindly rickshaw guy would stop and say, "Madam, I will take you home. Please don't walk on the street." And then they would start a conversation with the rickshaw guy saying, "But we don't want to go in the rickshaw. We want to walk on the road," or with a police person who would stop them and say the same thing, in a benevolent way also. Or they would then encounter some, as you pointed, some uncle type who would be masturbating at them on the road, and they would pick out their phones and say, "Uncle, we will make you famous on social media," and uncle would promptly zip himself up. So she said that these everyday acts of claiming transformed her embodied experience with the city. And I feel like many young women, whether it's the Why Loiter movement or the Blank Noise Project or the Girls at Dabas in Pakistan, or I think many young women are actually responding to this question of how to claim the public. They are niche and they are small ways of claiming the public, but in a very fundamental way they challenge the neoliberal agenda. They challenge this idea that when you're out in public you must consume in order to be productive, right? That when you're in public you should be drinking 200
Yeah.
rupees worth of coffee in order to be a good consumer and a good global capitalist citizen, a good neoliberal citizen. This idea which is of anti-productivity, of being on the streets and doing nothing. And I feel like the uh, pandemic has raised this question even in our homes, right? Because now many of us are working from home, and so the pressure to constantly be productive. So what does it mean to be non-productive? I think questions of productivity are something that we really need to address ourselves too. And for people of my generation, we also grew up in a time, eh, so I was a child in the 1980s when there was a category, and I often tell this to my students, called conspicuous consumption. And conspicuous consumption was a bad thing, right? You lived in a world of great inequality, and if you consumed too much, if you appeared to have too much, it was considered very bad form. It was considered obscene almost, because there were so many people who didn't have enough. And the
Yeah.
state took responsibility for housing, the state took responsibility. But now if you're poor, it's your fault, right? Neoliberalism has transformed that. And people are no longer ashamed to consume. They are no longer ashamed to spend crores, hundreds of crores on a wedding, having Beyonce dance at your wedding if you like, and publicizing how much you paid, or there's no shame in that
Yeah.
anymore. And I think that all of these issues are tied to the question of access to the public, because the public somehow has been erased from our imagination. And I but i do think that young people are
Mm.
pushing these agendas, and I think that we are also pushing these agendas when we claim our rights as citizens, because increasingly not just the right to recreation but the right to protest in public is also being taken away from us. Earlier you would be stuck in little small spaces. Now you're being, if you look at the if you look at the farmers movement, and as I'm sure you've seen the kind of barricades that were created to prevent them from entering Delhi city, right? So you have
Oh,
spikes and you have
yes,
barricades,
yes, yeah.
and you have construction, and you're digging up roads to prevent them. I mean, how afraid are you of a protesting citizen, right? And what does that tell us? And I feel like
Yeah.
today more than ever we need to connect all of these agendas, because even as they are coming for our rights as citizens, they are coming for our rights as women as well. And I think it's really, really important for us to,
Absolutely.
as to
Yeah.
where we can loiter. I find more and more people now loitering online, and I feel like, again, there have been accusations of sort of neoliberalism made, and certainly there is a divide, a digital divide, in who can loiter how much online. But there is also a divide on who can loiter how much in public space. And I feel like we also, and we've sort of, there's stalking happening online, there's violence happening online, and sort of the spaces, online spaces, in many ways replicate our relationships in public space, in on the city streets, right? Women are told, don't post anything, because once you post it out there, it's there to stay. And there's a fabulous essay by a scholar called Wendy Chun and Sarah Friedland. It's called Habits of Leaking, which tell women that, which I mean, one of the things they argue is that women are constantly told to be afraid of the public. And what's very exciting is also they make use of our work on loitering to make a case for loitering online. So I feel like until we can loiter in public
Oh,
spaces, one of the spaces that I think many women have found to loiter is online, which of course is not a substitute for real public spaces. And the question you raise about, I feel like we really need to pay a lot of attention to how to reclaim the gains that we have made in access to the public when the cities open up, and when our towns open up, and when we are on the other side, hopefully not too, in the not too distant future, when we are on the other side of this pandemic. And I think it's a question that we have to keep asking so that we don't forget.
yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, that was, I mean, it's such a pleasure listening to you talk about this. And it also reminded me that it was not just in Bombay. Like when I was working in Hyderabad, me and a feminist colleague of mine, we would go to Irani cafes in Hyderabad. Hyderabad is littered with these beautiful Irani cafes. But one thing that happens is there's great chai and it's so affordable. And it's almost a space of leisure because nobody tells you in an Irani cafe to get up and leave. Like you can buy one chai for $10 and sit there for 5 hours. You don't have like it, unlike your Starbucks, there's no plug point or a laptop, but you can sit with a newspaper and you see all of these old men, everybody, but it was always male dominated. And what we would do after work is just spend every time we wanted to stand or sit and talk somewhere, we would go to go to an Irani cafe and sit down. And I've realized that that doesn't I mean, I've not quite seen as many or any Irani cafes where I live in Bangalore, but to me in Hyderabad, that was just so special because suddenly it was cheap. I didn't have to spend $200 in a place when I had one or two other female friends to sit with and just, I don't know, enjoy a cup of tea and chat. And as you also talked about, even rest is a form of resistance, right? Where you talked about unproductivity, and rest is resistance is also, I think, a movement that Black feminists in the US and across places talk about. It's like, how do we then just taking care of our bodies and our minds in a way that is just a resistance to capitalism itself. And it's really interesting because all of these things tie down to this question of a feminist imagination. I titled this podcast The Feminist City precisely after, Utopia, and the first episode talks about Sultana's dream. And when people ask what is a feminist city, I say it's a dream, because I think we can only become more and more feminist, but I don't know if there would be. I don't even know what it would look like. When we were trying to sort of come up with illustrations to depict a feminist city, both me and the other illustrator, we were completely stumped, because we were like, what does it look like? One thing I was like, oh, maybe it'll have a lot more mirrors, because I want to see what I'm wearing at different places. Or it would have more bathrooms. And this process also sort of made me realize how disconnected we are from the body and our planet as well. Because on one hand, I never noticed how I don't drink water before I step out. Like, a lot of women don't drink water before they go out, because bathrooms are not available. So when women are working in the streets, where are women relieving themselves? It's almost like it's not even a question. Like, 50% of the city's population cannot do the most human function. And when we're menstruating, there are all of these questions. And I guess the question that I wanted to ask you is, how does one cultivate and nurture a feminist imagination? Like, what do you, because I think you've been doing this for such a long time. If you could leave our listeners with that, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again a fabulous question. And I'm not sure that people don't have a feminist imagination. I feel like when I see young women, my students, when I see the work that you are doing, when I see the kind of work that young women are engaged in today, and the kind of activism, it seems to me that young women and young men, and well, many young women and some young men have a feminist imagination that they're actually putting to very good use. The historical moment at which we find ourselves in some ways makes it very, very hard for us to imagine a utopia, right? For now, many of us, at least certainly people my age, would settle for a semblance of democracy. Even 2011, when our book was published, in retrospect feels almost a bit utopian, if you like, but to speak of a feminist city, or what we might imagine as a utopia, I feel like one of the things we need to think about in terms of cultivating the feminist imagination is to recognize that a feminist imagination in relation to the city is deeply tied to questions of infrastructure. The kinds of things that you pointed out, very, like when you were talking about a utopian city, you talked about toilets. And I think that toilets are so central to the recognition or the right to citizenship, right? That if you have a toilet every 500 meters, well lit, clean, open 24/7, it sends a very, very different message to people, that people belong in the city, that the city has provisions for them. So also with transport, transport 24/7. One of the things the Delhi government promised, and I think they've only done it so far for buses, not for the metro, is free transport. And I think for women, and one of the reasons I think people were so anxious about it is that now women could potentially walk out of their houses without any money, and they could get from point A to point B, right? So this kind of anxiety. So I think like 24/7 transport, railway stations and bus stops that are well lit, bus stops with seating, bus stops that are close to each other, or parks that have no fences, that don't have walls. Even like you were saying, promenades or parts of the city that middle class citizens seek to sort of control. In many of these promenades, you can't eat or drink. I feel like opening up those to hawkers, where you have hawkers offering affordable food as well as eyes on the street. Their lights contribute to the lighting. Restaurants that are open for longer and longer hours, because the city that's awake at night somehow is a city that's more accessible, that many people that many more people are comfortable in. So I realize I'm somehow digressing and talking about a feminist city. But to go back to your question on I am concerned about infrastructure and the feminist city, because I think it involves a lot of petitioning on our part of state structures. But I feel far, far less concerned about a feminist imagination. I feel really that, like, that young people are have a deeply democratic and feminist imagination, and I feel like it's the when I hear young people speak, when I see young people in protests, and last year when we were at the anti-CA protests, when I heard young people speak, it was among the few times that I felt real hope. I feel like young people do have a democratic and feminist imagination, and I feel that it's hopeful.
Yeah. No, that's a wonderful. Thank you so much. It is truly hopeful. I think even as you were speaking, I in the report that I wrote for my organization, this is exactly what we sort of focus on. And when we turn a feminist lens to the city, it is an infrastructure question, and then it's also locating a constitutional right to the city, right? I think when we locate a constitutional right to the city, what does it mean for a woman's right to the city, for a queer person's right to the city, for a girl's right to the city? And that then requires the shift of feminist intervention in municipal laws and urban planning laws rather than criminal law, which, with its carcerality, is actually a double-edged sword in terms of affecting or protecting or just securing rights for women. And I think yeah, this was, I mean, I can talk to you until the cows come home. So this was actually a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much, Shilpa. If you have anything else you'd like to add, please feel free to go ahead. Yes.
No, it was great to talk to you, and I listened to the other episodes of your podcast, and really, I mean, your podcast and others like them are among the things that give one hope for this city and for this country. So thank you for the work you do.